Berlin, August 1914. A single poster for the fatherland. The streets of Berlin are alive with the hustle of everyday life, yet the rhythm of the city has changed. Every lamppost, every wall, even the side of an old bakery, these spaces are filled with the same urgent message, bold, uncompromising, for the fatherland. It's not just a call for enlistment, it's a calculated psychological appeal designed to evoke duty, pride, and fear. The ink is fresh, but it already seems like an omnipresent force. Some soldiers, eyes fixed on the poster, almost stop in their tracks, caught between an anxious resolve and a deep uncertainty. This isn't a mere request. It's a silent command. For a moment, one can almost hear the sharp sound of the printing press, as if the weight of history itself is behind it. The poster speaks directly to the subconscious. This is your duty. This is your time. Those who pass by feel a rising unease, unsure whether to look away or to be a part of something much larger than themselves. The ink on paper is merely the vehicle for a much deeper, insidious manipulation, a weapon of mass persuasion that will soon change the course of history. The summer of 1914 wasn't just a time of brewing conflict. It was the dawn of a new kind of warfare. When the war broke out, it wasn't only the armies on the front lines that mattered. It was also the armies of words, images, and emotions that would wage war within the minds of every civilian. Governments across Europe had already been experimenting with propaganda in subtle ways, but now, with the outbreak of war, they were thrust into an all-out campaign for control over public opinion. The battlefield was no longer just about bullets and trenches, it was about perceptions, ideals, and beliefs. Psychologists like Edward Bernays, though not yet a household name, were already laying the groundwork for what would become modern propaganda theory. The idea was simple: manipulate the subconscious to sway collective behavior. What people thought was their own decision, like signing up for military service, was in fact carefully engineered. This wasn't just wartime necessity. It was a new era of psychological warfare, one where national pride, collective guilt, and fear of the enemy were weaponized to fuel the war machine. The posters, the speeches, the films, every element was crafted with precision to create an emotional response, pushing citizens toward actions they might not have otherwise taken. By the fall of 1914, the scale of propaganda had expanded exponentially. In London, a mother's love for her children was used to lure men into enlisting, with posters showing young soldiers marching off to fight, their faces full of pride and determination. In Paris, the face of the enemy was increasingly painted as a barbaric, monstrous force, an image so repulsive it justified any sacrifice. In Berlin, the message was more subtle, tapping into a deep sense of national honor and the idea that the fatherland was a moral force that must prevail. But this wasn't just about spreading fear or rallying the troops. It was about creating a sense of unity and purpose, both among the soldiers and the people back home. The war effort wasn't simply a political act, it was a collective moral obligation. On both sides, governments realized that public opinion was as important as military might. A nation could withstand defeat on the battlefield, but a loss of morale at home could topple a regime. This is why propaganda wasn't just a side strategy, it was an integrated part of the war effort. It could control who supported the war and who might oppose it. By 1917, each nation had perfected its own propaganda machine. Posters, radio broadcasts, and pamphlets were now tools of mass mobilization. The public was made to feel that every act of support, from buying war bonds to sending loved ones off to fight, was a vital part of the national cause. At its core, it was a war for hearts and minds, one that could only be won by dominating the narrative and keeping the masses emotionally engaged. In this way, propaganda became an invisible front in the war, a battle not for territory, but for the soul of the people. But behind the striking images and clever slogans lay a darker truth. Propaganda, at its core, wasn't just about motivating people to fight. It was about controlling a narrative, shaping a collective belief system that made war seem not only inevitable, but righteous. And in doing so, it raised a profound question. If public opinion could be so easily shaped by a few words and images, what did that say about the power of the masses to think for themselves? This wasn't a new phenomenon. But in the case of World War I, the scale and precision with which propaganda was deployed marked the beginning of a new era in psychological manipulation. Governments had begun to realize the immense power they wielded, not just with tanks or armies, but through the images they projected, the words they chose, and the emotions they stirred. The birth of modern warfare was no longer just a clash of physical forces. It was a battle for the mind, where the fight for public opinion had become as significant as any battle on the front lines. As the war raged on, the relentless stream of wartime propaganda began to blur the line between truth and manipulation. The posters, films, and speeches weren't just encouraging enlistment. They were shaping entire worldviews. Young men, once uncertain about their purpose, became soldiers not just of the state, but of an idea, a concept of honor, duty, and sacrifice that had been expertly constructed in their minds. These ideas were powerful, but they were also dangerous. Propaganda didn't merely glorify war. It dehumanized the enemy, turning human beings into faceless, monstrous caricatures. The enemy was no longer a nation of people with their own fears, hopes, and desires. It was an embodiment of evil, a force that had to be eradicated. This dehumanization made the realities of war more bearable for those fighting in it, but it also made the horrors of war easier to accept for the home front. As nations geared up for total war, the real cost of propaganda became more apparent. The toll wasn't just counted in military casualties, it was in the lives forever changed by the manipulation of their emotions. The war had succeeded in mobilizing entire populations, but at what cost? The truth behind the glorified images of soldiers marching bravely off to battle wasn't just a dark irony. It was a tragedy that unfolded slowly in the minds of millions, long after the war had ended. The moment of truth came in 1918, when Germany, on the brink of collapse, began to question its own narrative. The same people who had once marched proudly under the "For the Fatherland" banner now faced a bleak, desolate future. The promises of victory, the same promises that had fueled the initial rush to war, were now shattered beyond recognition. The war that had been sold as an inevitable victory for the glory of the nation had dragged on for years, and now the country was on the brink of collapse. Soldiers returning from the front lines, disillusioned and scarred, were met not with victory parades, but with the harsh realities of a country in ruin. The disillusionment was evident in every corner of German society. Once proud, heroic soldiers, the very men who had been promised that they were fighting for honor and the protection of their families, now returned home to find a broken country, economically shattered and morally fractured. The heroic images from the posters that had filled the streets were now exposed as lies. Propaganda, which had once unified the country, had now become a symbol of betrayal. And yet, the most ironic twist of all was that the narrative created by propaganda had not only failed to bring about the promised victory, it had left an entire generation mentally broken. Those who had been fed the illusion of national glory now found themselves trapped in the aftermath of a war they had been taught to believe was just. The soldiers who had fought and died were not heroes, they were victims of a lie. Their sacrifice had been manipulated, and their deaths had been framed as part of a righteous cause that had never existed. By the early 1920s, Europe was a fractured continent, filled with broken promises and fractured minds. The aftermath of WWI wasn't just measured in physical destruction, it was felt deeply in the psyche of a generation. Propaganda had done its job in mobilizing a nation, but it had done so at the expense of the very soul of its people. By the end of the war, the once heroic images of "for the fatherland" were shattered, replaced with the grim realities of what had been lost. Those who returned from the front were haunted by the question, what was it all for? And yet, the effects of this manipulation didn't fade with the end of the war. By the 1920s, the same psychological techniques employed during the conflict were now being adapted by rising political movements across Europe. The power of propaganda had been fully realized, not just in wartime, but in the shaping of national identities and political ideologies. Propaganda would become the backbone of authoritarian regimes, from fascist Italy to Nazi Germany, and even beyond into the Cold War. The irony was that propaganda, designed to unite, had divided Europe in ways no one had anticipated. What had started as a means of winning hearts and minds in the service of war had evolved into a tool of control, shaping the very nature of politics, identity, and reality itself. The war was over, but the ideas that had driven it, ideas about loyalty, duty, sacrifice, and national pride, would live on, twisted and manipulated for decades to come. In a way, the true legacy of WWI wasn't the bloodshed. It was the lessons learned by those in power about the incredible strength of ideas. Propaganda had shown how easily the masses could be led to believe in something greater than themselves, how a single image, a single slogan could move nations to war. But it also showed the danger of such power, how it could be used to manipulate the truth and distort reality for a generation. World War I had marked the dawn of modern propaganda, but its legacy reached far beyond the trenches and battlefields. In the years following the war, the lessons of mass persuasion weren't forgotten. They were refined. The methods of psychological manipulation that had been first tested on the soldiers and civilians of Europe would now be adapted for peacetime uses. The rise of radio as a medium of mass communication, the advent of cinema, and the growth of the advertising industry all served to further entrench the use of propaganda in everyday life. In post-war Germany, the bitterness of defeat mixed with the lingering power of nationalist sentiment, creating a fertile ground for the rise of extremist ideologies. The Nazis, under Adolf Hitler, would prove to be masters of propaganda, using the same techniques that had been perfected during WWI, but with far more sinister consequences. The Führer's speeches, combined with the Nazi propaganda machine, were designed to invoke fear, pride, and hatred, blending past propaganda's calls to patriotism with a new, more dangerous narrative, that the German people had been betrayed by the Jews, by communists, by anyone who didn't fit into their vision of national greatness. Meanwhile, in Italy, Benito Mussolini was applying similar tactics to solidify his fascist regime. Both men, drawing directly from the propaganda playbook of WWI, would use the same psychological methods of persuasion to rally millions, shaping their citizens' worldviews and directing them toward ideological conformity. What had begun in 1914 as a tool to spur men to enlist for war was now employed to unite entire populations under totalitarian rule. What is even more chilling than the use of propaganda in totalitarian regimes is its adoption by democracies. In the aftermath of WWI, democratic nations like the United States and the United Kingdom didn't abandon the tools of persuasion, they simply reimagined them. Propaganda shifted from its original wartime function to become a tool of persuasion in peacetime, deeply embedded in the economic and political fabric of modern democratic life. In the United States, the Committee on Public Information, which had been responsible for propagating war support during WWI, evolved into a highly efficient machine for influencing public opinion. The same techniques were applied to mass consumer advertising. Companies like Ford, General Motors, and Coca-Cola began to adopt the principles of propaganda to sell products, appealing to emotions rather than logic. This shift from war propaganda to commercial propaganda laid the groundwork for the consumer-driven societies that flourished in the West in the 20th century. Politicians, too, adapted these techniques. Franklin D. Roosevelt's fireside chats used the same basic principles of emotional connection and repetition that had been so effective during the war. Through radio, Roosevelt created a sense of intimacy with the American public, giving them the impression that they were having a personal conversation with their leader. It wasn't just about policy, it was about creating an emotional bond, a psychological sense of unity that allowed him to implement sweeping reforms during the Great Depression. In the UK, Winston Churchill's speeches, while grounded in the grim realities of war, carried the same psychological weight. His words rallied the British people, lifting their spirits in their darkest hours, appealing not just to their sense of duty, but to their very identity as Britons. Propaganda in these democratic settings blurred the lines between emotional appeal and political necessity, showcasing how persuasive techniques could be used to unite populations even in non-totalitarian regimes. As the 20th century marched on, the power of propaganda was no longer confined to any single nation or ideology. By the time World War II erupted, propaganda had become a tool of global significance. Every major power on Earth was using it, refining it, and integrating it into their military and civilian infrastructure. What had been tested on a national scale in the 1910s was now being applied to the geopolitical landscape. In the United States, the government's use of propaganda during WWI reached new heights with the creation of iconic posters like Uncle Sam Wants You and films like Why We Fight, which explained the moral imperative of defeating the Axis powers. Hollywood, once a pacifist industry, was now fully mobilized in the service of war propaganda. Actors like James Stewart, Clark Gable, and John Wayne were not just stars. They were soldiers, selling the war to the American public with every frame they shot. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union's propaganda was becoming a carefully controlled apparatus, with Joseph Stalin using the state-controlled media to create a larger-than-life image of the Soviet regime, all while demonizing the capitalist West. The hammer and sickle, the iconic symbol of the revolution, became a globally recognized emblem of resistance, pride, and revolution. Stalin's propaganda machine would later lay the foundation for Cold War propaganda, as the US and Soviet Union entered an ideological battle that spanned decades. In post-war Europe, propaganda was used to promote reconstruction efforts, frame the rise of the European Union, and push back against communist influence. During the Cold War, both sides perfected the use of mass communication to shape public opinion, not just at home, but in the entire world. The ability to control the message, whether it was about the threat of communism or the benefits of democracy, became just as important as controlling the military. By the mid-20th century, propaganda had evolved from simple posters and speeches to a sophisticated machine powered by new technology. Television became the new frontier for political manipulation. No longer confined to pamphlets or newsprint, propaganda could now reach directly into homes across the globe. Politicians like John F. Kennedy and Richard Nixon mastered the power of television, understanding that a well-crafted appearance, how you looked, how you spoke, how you carried yourself, was just as important as your policies. The visual language of politics shifted, and political campaigns began to operate much like consumer products. Image was everything. Kennedy's debates with Nixon in 1960 marked the first truly televised presidential debates, with the visual aspect of his polished, youthful presence being contrasted against Nixon's disheveled appearance, which became an instant media sensation. Here, the line between propaganda and public relations blurred even further. It wasn't just about what you said, it was about how you were perceived, and television created a new realm for mass persuasion. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, propaganda continued its hold over public life, albeit through a more controlled, rigid structure. The state-run media was a mechanism through which the government could propagate ideological conformity. The image of Lenin, Stalin, and later figures like Gorbachev became symbolic representations of the communist ideal. These were not just political figures, they were myths, crafted for the masses to idolize. With the invention of television, followed by satellite technology, governments no longer had to rely solely on national borders to disseminate propaganda. They could now project their messages across the globe. In fact, the media itself had become a global stage upon which nations could battle for ideological supremacy. Propaganda was no longer merely a tool of political regimes, it had become a weapon in the geopolitical struggle between East and West. The Cold War became the ultimate battleground for the ideological use of propaganda, with both the United States and the Soviet Union leveraging their respective media empires to spread their worldview. The United States, having mastered the art of commercial propaganda, now used its media power to promote democracy, capitalism, and freedom. Radio Free Europe and Voice of America broadcasted across Eastern Europe, injecting the ideas of Western democracy into countries locked behind the Iron Curtain. These broadcasts, along with films like Rocky and Rambo, portrayed America not just as a political force, but as a cultural beacon of hope, offering individual freedom and success to all. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union's propaganda machine had a more centralized approach, with state-run media pushing the narrative of the Soviet Union as the true champion of peace, equality, and workers' rights. The images of the Soviet soldier, stoic, resolute, and powerful, were carefully crafted to stand in opposition to the supposed decadence and corruption of the capitalist West. Soviet films and broadcasts portrayed a utopian society where equality reigned and the working class was empowered. Both sides engaged in a psychological war that went beyond mere political conflict. It was a battle for the global mind. Through carefully cultivated media images and narratives, both the United States and the Soviet Union sought to present their system as the only one that could offer a future worth living. These ideological wars, fought in the realm of the mind, shaped not only political allegiances, but the very identities of nations. The rise of the Internet has transformed propaganda once again, now allowing for direct, personalized influence over public opinion. In the early 21st century, the Internet created a new kind of mass media, a media that was both hyper-targeted and hyper-accelerated. Propaganda, once limited by geographic and political boundaries, was now global. Social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram allowed governments, organizations, and individuals to tailor messages to very specific groups, creating a new form of manipulation, digital propaganda. During the 2016 US presidential election, the power of digital propaganda was exposed on a global scale. The manipulation of social media algorithms to target political ads, fake news, and emotional manipulation strategies became a pivotal part of modern-day elections. Data was now the driving force behind propaganda. Whether it was through political ads, memes, or viral videos, digital propaganda leveraged the power of mass personalization to influence elections in ways that had been impossible before. What made this new era of propaganda so insidious was its ability to influence emotions directly. With our algorithms designed to promote content that evoked strong emotional responses, anger, fear, joy, social media became a powerful tool for manipulating public sentiment. The personal nature of digital propaganda made it more dangerous than anything the world had seen before, with individuals now receiving content not just from traditional media, but from their own social circles, often blurring the lines between authentic communication and crafted messaging. As we look to the future, it becomes evident that the battle for public opinion will continue to evolve. In a world where misinformation spreads faster than ever, and where everyone has a voice, the question arises, how can we trust what we see, hear, and read? The very concept of truth is now in question. Propaganda has become so embedded in our media landscape that it has become a tool not just of governments, but of corporations, social movements, and individuals. Every day, we are bombarded with messages designed to shape our beliefs, opinions, and actions. The line between truth and persuasion is now thinner than ever. The future of propaganda is likely to be shaped by emerging technologies like artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and deepfake videos that will make it even more difficult to distinguish reality from manipulation. Will we reach a point where propaganda is so sophisticated that it becomes impossible to discern fact from fiction? And what does that mean for our ability to make informed decisions as individuals and as a society? As the digital age continues to progress, one thing is certain. Propaganda will remain a powerful force, one that will shape not just how we perceive the world, but how we act within it. Berlin, November 1918. The For the Fatherland posters that once saturated every corner of the city are now peeling off the walls. The once proud message, a symbol of unity and national pride, is now a remnant of the past, a faded testament to the power of words and images to manipulate, to incite, and to divide. The same streets that once echoed with the sounds of marching soldiers now hum with the quiet footsteps of those who have returned, broken and disillusioned. The very poster that rallied millions to their deaths now seems like a haunting memory. What was once a tool of purpose and resolve now hangs as a relic of a forgotten hope, as empty as the promises it had made. But even as these posters decay, the question lingers. How much of the propaganda of 1914-1918 was truly left behind? In many ways, the power of these posters, these images, these messages has not faded. It has simply transformed. The techniques that created the For the Fatherland narrative have continued to shape the modern world. From the advertisements we see on our phones, to the political messages that flash across our screens, to the ideological battles waged across social media platforms. The true legacy of the war propaganda is not simply in its historical impact, but in how it continues to influence the narratives of today. Every political campaign, every viral advertisement, every cause that tries to rally the masses to action carries the ghost of those same techniques. And as we move further into the 21st century, we must ask ourselves, in a world flooded with information and media, do we truly control the messages we receive, or have we become as susceptible to manipulation as the men who marched into battle in 1914, armed with nothing but a single poster and a message that told them who they were supposed to be? The answer to this question may shape the future of propaganda and its role in the minds of the generations to come. For even now, the most powerful tool in shaping human behavior remains the same. It is the message and how it is told. The final truth of propaganda is that it never truly disappears. Even as the war posters of WWI are torn down and forgotten, the mind behind them lives on. Every nation, every political party, every corporation now employs the same psychological tactics that shaped the events of the past. The tools of propaganda, those carefully crafted messages that sway minds, have evolved with technology, but the underlying principles remain the same. Appeal to emotion, stir the subconscious, and shape the narrative. In this sense, propaganda has become as inevitable as history itself. It is not just an instrument of war or politics. It is a tool of social order, of belief, of identity. And while we may look back at the past with the hindsight of knowledge and wisdom, the truth remains. Those who control the narrative control the future. The rise of the internet, social media, and AI-powered algorithms has transformed the way propaganda spreads, but it has not changed the power of persuasion. Instead of posters pasted on walls, we now face endless streams of digital content, tailored specifically to our desires, fears, and biases. We are bombarded, not with ink on paper, but with pixels and data, each piece carefully engineered to keep us engaged, to manipulate us, to drive us to action. Perhaps the greatest lesson of propaganda is not about the past, but about the future. As technology advances, so too does the sophistication of manipulation. The question we must ask ourselves is not whether propaganda will continue to exist, but whether we will ever be able to escape its grip. And in a world where information is as powerful as any army, perhaps the most pressing battle we face is not on the front lines of war, but in the battle for truth itself. As we enter the 21st century, one thing becomes abundantly clear. Propaganda, in its most refined forms, has become an omnipresent force in our lives. What once began as crude posters and nationalistic slogans has now evolved into an intricate web of digital manipulation, cultural influence, and emotional persuasion. The rise of big data, artificial intelligence, and digital algorithms has reshaped the way propaganda is deployed. Today, your beliefs, preferences, and even your emotional state can be predicted, analyzed, and influenced with surgical precision. With the power of targeted political ads, influencer campaigns, and viral social media trends, propaganda no longer belongs solely to governments. It is now in the hands of corporations, tech giants, media moguls, and even individual activists. The battlefield is no longer confined to the pages of newspapers or the airwaves of radio. Now it's a digital war waged 24/7 across platforms that shape and dictate what we see, hear, and believe. The consequences of this shift are profound. The very nature of truth has been weaponized. What was once a single narrative controlled by a government is now a fractured, multifaceted story told by thousands, each with their own agenda. The result is a fragmented society, divided not just by political ideology, but by information itself. Our sense of reality is increasingly shaped not by objective facts, but by the narratives we are fed daily. In this new age of digital propaganda, the traditional boundaries of propaganda, used to rally a nation to war, sell a product, or even foster collective ideals, are blurred beyond recognition. The goal is no longer simply persuasion, it is full-scale cognitive manipulation. The manipulation is no longer limited to national borders. It is global, reaching individuals across continents, all influenced by personalized content that resonates with their deepest fears, desires, and biases. The psychological impact of propaganda has always been profound, but as technology advances, so does the sophistication of its manipulation. Today, propaganda is no longer just about influencing thought, it is about shaping behavior. The tools of mass persuasion, whether it's a political rally, a marketing campaign, or a viral hashtag, are no longer just about convincing people to act in a certain way. They are designed to create a new reality for individuals to live within, a reality that aligns with a specific agenda. The manipulation is no longer subtle. It is a daily pervasive force that shapes our identities, relationships, and even our interactions with the world around us. Through targeted advertising and the use of persuasive algorithms, propaganda has entered the very fabric of our online experience. The feed that appears on your social media platform is not just a collection of posts. It is a curated, tailored version of reality designed to keep you engaged, to keep you clicking, to keep you coming back for more. But the most dangerous aspect of this digital propaganda is its ability to create echo chambers. The algorithms that power these platforms prioritize content that resonates with the individual's existing beliefs, reinforcing their worldview and creating a closed loop of information. People are no longer exposed to differing viewpoints. They are only shown content that validates their opinions, further cementing their biases. This leads to a fractured world where people live in entirely different realities and where truth becomes subjective, based entirely on the content they consume. This digital age of propaganda has made it easier than ever to manipulate the masses, but it also raises new ethical questions. At what point does personalized marketing or political campaigning cross the line into psychological manipulation? Can a society ever truly be free when the very way we think, feel, and act is being influenced at every turn? As we stand on the precipice of this new age, we must ask ourselves, Are we truly in control of the narratives that shape our world? In the digital era, the battle for hearts and minds is more sophisticated than ever. Propaganda is no longer a tool for wartime, but an ongoing process embedded into the fabric of society. The rise of AI-powered bots, deepfakes, and mass surveillance presents an unprecedented challenge to traditional notions of privacy, free thought, and democracy. The question of who controls the narrative is no longer solely in the hands of governments or media conglomerates. It is now in the hands of every individual who shares content, comments on posts, or clicks on links. Each action is part of the larger digital landscape, shaping the very discourse that governs society. But the greater danger lies in the ability of corporations and political entities to manipulate this discourse on an even larger scale, in ways that we are still only beginning to understand. Perhaps the only true defense against the growing dominance of propaganda in the digital age is critical awareness, the ability to recognize when we are being influenced, to question the sources of information we consume, and to understand the psychological tactics used to manipulate us is more crucial than ever. In an age where reality is increasingly malleable, the most powerful weapon at our disposal is the ability to think critically and independently. Without this, we risk becoming passive consumers of content, forever at the mercy of those who seek to shape our worldviews for their own gain. Propaganda is not just a tool of war or politics, it's the lens through which we view reality itself. For over a century, from the streets of Berlin in 1914 to the targeted ads on our smartphones today, propaganda has woven itself into the very fabric of society. It started with simple posters and words designed to rally soldiers to fight for a cause, but it has evolved into something much more pervasive and insidious. Today, it is everywhere. It's in the advertisements we see, the political messages we hear, and the social media posts we consume. It influences not only what we buy, but how we vote, how we think, and even who we love. We are now living in a world where our reality is increasingly constructed by unseen forces. Algorithms, governments, corporations, and media moguls, all vying for control over our beliefs and behaviors. As the digital age progresses, we are bombarded by an overwhelming amount of information, much of it designed to manipulate us into thinking, acting, and reacting in specific ways. And while we have more access to information than ever before, the question remains, how do we distinguish fact from fiction when the very nature of truth is being manipulated? The tragic irony is that despite all the progress we've made in technology and communication, we find ourselves at a crossroads. The same tools that have brought us closer together have also created vast chasms of division. What once started as a way to unite people for war has now become a tool to divide, conquer, and control. In the years ahead, the battle for truth will not be fought with guns or tanks, but with information. And as the influence of propaganda continues to evolve, we must ask, will we be able to recognize the forces manipulating us? Or will we be forever lost in the haze of a world where perception is reality and reality is up for sale? The posters of 1914 are long gone, their ink faded into history. Yet the questions they raised remain, echoing through time. How much of what we see, hear, and believe is truly our own? In the end, the story of propaganda is not just about the past, it's about the future. It is about understanding that the forces shaping our world today are not new. They are simply repurposed, refined, and empowered by new technologies. The legacy of WWI propaganda is not confined to the battlefield. It lives on in every screen, every image, every message that enters our minds. It is a reminder that the power to shape a nation, a society, or even an individual lies not in armies, but in the stories we tell, the ideas we embrace, and the truths we choose to accept. The question we must answer is this: will we recognize the tools of persuasion when they are used against us? Or will we continue to march, as we did in 1914, believing that we are acting on our own volition, when in reality we are simply following the drumbeat of someone else's narrative. As we look back on the past, we are reminded of how deeply propaganda shaped the course of history. From the streets of Berlin in 1914 to the digital feeds that populate our lives today, the mechanisms of influence have evolved, but the core principles of persuasion remain the same. The impact of propaganda is not just a relic of war, it is a living, breathing force that continues to shape the politics, ideologies, and behaviors of individuals and nations alike. The true power of propaganda lies not in its ability to convince us of facts, but in its capacity to mold perceptions, challenge beliefs, and direct actions. It speaks to our deepest emotions, fear, pride, anger, hope, and crafts narratives that seem natural, even inevitable. But behind every image, every slogan, and every tweet, there is an unseen hand guiding the way we think, feel, and act. The history of propaganda, from its beginnings in WWI to its present-day role in digital media, is a reminder that information is power. In today's hyper-connected world, where information is as accessible as it is overwhelming, we must ask ourselves how much of what we believe is truly our own. The battle for truth has never been more important. In an era where narratives can be constructed, manipulated, and shared at lightning speed, we are faced with a new kind of warfare, one not fought with tanks and bullets, but with ideas and images. To win this battle, we must learn to see beyond the surface, to question the sources that shape our worldview, and to understand the profound impact of propaganda on the societies we live in. The question is no longer, what will we believe, but who will we allow to tell us what to believe? As we move forward, we must carry the lessons of the past with us. Propaganda is not a tool of the past, but a force that will continue to shape the future. In this new age of digital media, where the boundaries between truth and fiction are increasingly blurred, our ability to critically evaluate the information we encounter has never been more crucial. The messages we receive are not neutral. They are carefully crafted, strategically designed, and aimed at shaping our minds. The legacy of WWI propaganda and the lessons it offers are more than just a history lesson. They are a call to action. We must be vigilant, questioning not just the content, but the source, the motive, and the agenda behind every piece of information we encounter. Only then can we begin to reclaim control over the narratives that shape our lives and ensure that we are not passive subjects in a world built on the manipulation of truth.